that was all over by about 11:30 in the morning, and as one Union officer was riding along with the flash of troops were sent out, he recalled that it was a short distance to the Lynchburg Road. There was the saddest sight I saw during the war. The ground was covered as thick as they could lie with dead bodies, Union and Confederate, mostly Confederate. Only the white flag of surrender could have been waved 5 minutes sooner. Some 100 good men might have gone home to their wives and families. But, as he remarked, such is war. About 2 hours after the final shots were fired, 16 officers, 2 Confederate, 14 Union, met in the parlor of the McLean home, and the process of writing out formal terms of surrender began. The terms that Lee would receive from Grant were quite generous. At the very least, the Confederate soldiers would be able to return home, though officers could keep their sidearms. If soldiers had horses and mules, they could take those home with them, and private baggage could go as well. If in the following day, April the 10th, it was agreed that parole passes would be printed for the Confederate troops, and 30,000 of those would eventually be churned out of the Clover Hill Tavern. And then over the next 3 days, the 10th included, Confederate arms of service would surrender their weapons and prepare to head home, beginning with the cavalry. April the 12th in the afternoon, the final infantry of the Army of Northern Virginia stacked their weapons along the stage road, marched back to camp, and prepared to head home. It seemed, at least initially, that the formula for all future surrenders in the war had been set in stone. All of that would begin to come crashing down, though, the evening of April the 14th, in Ford's Theater, where President Lincoln was shot. The nation is, at the very least, thrown into shock, though many Union officials also begin to question how the surrenders should be facilitated in the future. Perhaps Confederate officials should be tried for treason. Others say that perhaps all Confederate soldiers should be held as prisoners of war until the end of hostilities. Ultimately, though, now President Andrew Johnson and other Union Army officials agree that Confederate soldiers will be given generous terms throughout. Sure enough, President Johnson declares the war formally at an end. But the peace that follows will perhaps be more complex than the war itself was. And with that in mind, I'd like to close with 3 final cemeteries here in the park that I believe help to tell a little bit of that story. First of which is over on the eastern edge of the courthouse. Unfortunately out of view, it is the Robinson Family Cemetery, located behind the Kelly House. The Robinsons, up until April the 9th, 1865, were enslaved, along with 4,600 other individuals here in the county. The Union Army brought with it the Emancipation Proclamation, though the exact meaning of the freedom that had come would continue to be debated for decades or more than that. For those former slaves, however, the long-sought-for promise of freedom had arrived. That summer, Union Army contingent was sent down to accompany these 188th Pennsylvania. One of their main goals would have been to work with the Robinsons and other slave families, or former slave families, I should say, to work out labor contracts with former masters. The main reason they were sent down here, of course, was to keep law and order. But one of the officers in that unit ended up staying a little while longer. His name was Henry Cogan, and while posted here, he met and fell in love with the daughter of the owner of the Clover Hill Tavern. Her name was Emma Hicks. After his terms of enlistment were up, he came back down here, and the couple were married in 1866. And though this is a small picture, if any of you would like, I can pass it around or show you after the talk is concluded. This is a family picture taken a few years after the war of the Cogan family. Unfortunately, they didn't get long to enjoy this. Both of them passed away from tuberculosis in the beginning years of the 1870s. Though their graves are unmarked, they are buried back behind the tavern in the Patterson Hicks burial grounds. You might be able to see a couple trees standing in the middle of that fenced-off area. That is the cemetery. You see so soon after the war, perhaps a surprising example of reconciliation on a local level, though perhaps a more recognizable example on a larger national scale can be found in the Confederate cemetery. There are 19 graves there. 11 are unknown, one of which is a Union soldier. I mentioned by way of Clark that most of the Union dead were taken to Poplar Grove National Cemetery. Accidentally, of course, at least one of these soldiers was left behind. The Ladies' Association that formed to establish that Confederate cemetery could have quite easily refused to include him in that burial ground. Of the 800 soldiers that left Appomttox, a third never came home. Nevertheless, those ladies said that he would be given the same burial honors as the Confederate soldiers from just down the road or as far afield as southern Louisiana. And thus, even today, you'll see on the long row of Confederate graves a Union grave decorated with the same honors. And you'll see that trend continued in public and private cemeteries throughout the nation. A lot of that has its origins, as a matter of fact, in the words that Grant told his soldiers as he left the McLean house. As he rode back towards the Union lines, he heard the sound of cannon fire, cheers, bands playing. Grant ordered that to stop immediately, stating that these were their fellow citizens once again, not to be humiliated. And thus the soldiers complied. And you know, a lot of those soldiers in those cemeteries, such as the one up on that ridge, died before the war ended. But ultimately, in death, they were Americans once again, fulfilling Grant's orders to his soldiers. Just something to think about. So that concludes my talk. If y'all have any questions, please feel free to ask. I hope y'all enjoy the rest of your visit and have a great day. Thank you.
Hill, about 3 miles behind the hospital there. And it was a hill because they would just take the bodies from the hospital, throw them there, dig dirt, or trench beside them. They would just dig the dirt out of that and throw it on top. Kind of made a hill with bodies over time. It's awful down there in the hospital. But I was sitting back here on furlough for some time. It finally got better. It was back down there in Petersburg. And then things weren't much better than when I left. Worse, in fact. The 5 rail lines we had open, they were all but closed. Only one on the south side of the railroad, one that comes up here to Appomttox Station, that was the only one left open. And so we were protecting that line at all costs down there in those trenches. Not a whole lot of real fighting. And of course, you stand up here for the moment, mini balls start flying all around you from those Yankee sharpshooters. Lost some good men that way. But we didn't have much supplies down there. We had rice and cornmeal, and Johnny cakes, just a hard cracker out of cornmeal we make. But we could smell the bread coming in on the trains from City Point. The Union soldiers eating fresh bread every morning. It was hard to smell that and try to eat down whatever morsels we could find. They'd send us sugar. They told us to put it in our coffee, but the quartermaster never sent any coffee. And so what we would do is, when it would snow down there, it was one of the coldest winters down there in Petersburg, I can remember. But we'd take the snow, put it in our tin cups, mix the sugar in with that, and kind of make an ice cream. Folks may have heard of that. But conditions were down there rather bad. Any other particular questions about the war?
How are you doing now?
Well, now that it's all over, I'm trying to deal with it all. See, and then I used to play Bunker Hill over there with some of the other folks from the village when we were just youngins. And back then, someone would fall down, he'd hop right back up. But I saw some of those same boys fall on the battlefield, knowing they'd never get up again. Just dealing with that, trying to figure out how to get on with your life. In my company, when we were down there in Petersburg, there were about 100 of us. When we were marching up this road the day of the surrender there on April 12th, there were only 9 of us left. 90% of our company was gone. Trying to figure out why it was me and those 8 other boys coming home, not someone like James Cheatham, one of my friends that was shot down there. Well, it wasn't him, it was me coming home. Our farms, they're certainly different now that the war is over. Without the slaves, we can't tend the tobacco fields like we used to. But we only had 3 slaves to begin with, so it didn't affect us as much as someone like Mr. White, a Scottish immigrant, lives over there, had 360-something before the war. But we're trying to get that working again. The farm is different without the slaves. They have nowhere else to go. They come back just wanting to work for us, but our Confederate money's worthless. We can't pay them anything. And so we worked out deals with some of ours so they can get food and shelter and a bit of our crop in return for their labor. We're having to plant more food crops, not tobacco as much, so we're not getting as many greenbacks this year. Also, just trying to wake up every morning, dealing with the fact that there was once a cause you were willing to wake up every morning and die for, and now it can no longer be realized. There'll be hard feelings between the North and the South for some time.
You weren't able to enlist right away.
No, I wasn't. I was only 15 years old when the war started. Of course, many of the boys, they went ahead and joined up if they were that young, but my father needed my help on the farm. But those boys that were only 16, 17, when they joined up back in 61, they had a little trick they'd do. There'd be an officer over there in front of the courthouse, and he'd go up to him and enlist, and he'd ask you a few questions. Well, one of those questions was, are you over 18? Since that's all you had to be to join the Army. Well, those boys don't want to tell a lie, break the Southern Code of Honor or anything. What they would do is, they'd take a slip of paper, write the number 18 on it, and put it inside their shoe. So then when the gentleman asked, are you over 18? They'd say, well, yes, sir, I am.
Oh.
Indeed they were. Perhaps not the same sense of but plenty of boys went off fight that way. But yeah, I didn't join up until 64. We needed help on the farm.
Now you said after the war you went back to the farming part and growing tobacco. Now, did you sell the tobacco to the Yankees then?
Well, most of the time we send it over to Lynchburg or perhaps Farmville sometimes. Sometimes it ends up down at Danville and they auction it off.
Auction them off?
Help folks over from England, they take their liking to it, send their ships over and get it from us. And I may even have a twist over here. You folks ever seen fine Virginia dark leaf? This here's for Charlie, kind of twisted into this, dipped in molasses. You don't want to see that.